The world's strangest forgotten conspiracy theories. The Lost Cosmonauts. The space race between the United States and Russia during the 50s, 60s and 70s is a source of many of the most well-known conspiracy theories. Perhaps the greatest of all is the idea that the moon landing was faked and that Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong never set foot on the surface of the moon. As one of the most enduring conspiracy theories, there are still television shows, books and articles being produced to this day which entertain the idea. But the space race involved two parties. As well as the Americans, the Soviets also produced their own strange tales. Among these is the idea of the failed space flights. Otherwise known as the Lost Cosmonauts theory, it suggests that a number of people died as the Soviets attempted to put a man into orbit, but their deaths were covered up by the government in order to maintain their reputation. Anyone who has studied the travails and achievements of both sides of the space race will know that a Russian man named Yuri Gagarin is commonly credited as the first man in space. However, the conspiracy theory suggests that rather than being the first man to enter space, he was simply the first to survive. According to the theory, there were at least two men who preceded him, who did not make it back to Earth. As well as the two deaths, there have been suggestions that a third cosmonaut misjudged his entry and found himself having landed in China. Together, they are known as the Lost Cosmonauts. The idea of the lost Soviet spacemen is not recent. Rather, it can be traced back as far as 1959. In December of that year, high-ranking members of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia released a series of leaks which seemed to include a number of unofficial shots of space. These documents included the name Alexei Ledovsky, who, it was suggested, had been sent into space inside an R-5A rocket the Russian scientists had converted. He was not thought to have survived. As well as Ledovsky, 3 more names of men and women were included. These leaks backed up information that had come from a space theoretician, named Hermann Oberth, who had told stories of a man being killed during a suborbital flight in 1958. Of the world's news groups, only an Italian agency named Continentale picked up on the Czech stories and reported the deaths. While they were able to name the supposedly dead cosmonauts, they were not able to confirm Oberth's theory of this deadly suborbital flight. The next spate of deaths involved a group of high-altitude parachutists. Colonel Peter Dolgov, Ivan Kacher, and Alexei Grachov all had their photos published in a 1959 issue of Ogoniok, but would die over the coming years. They were thought to have been involved in the testing of extreme high-altitude equipment, including Sokol pressure chutes that would be direct ancestors of those used in Soviet space flights. While Dolgov is known to have died in action, Kacher simply disappeared shortly after. Another man, Gennady Zavadovsky, was also pictured with the parachutists. He too disappeared before his name eventually appeared on a list of dead cosmonauts long after, with no details of the exact nature of his death nor the date. High-altitude parachutists had often been rumoured as the precursors to the Soviet cosmonauts. Used to extreme altitudes, they were perfect candidates to test the equipment as the Russians climbed higher and higher into the atmosphere. During the 1960s, both Yaroslav Golganov, a Russian journalist, and the New York Journal American published investigations into the parachutists' involvement in the cosmonaut program, which eventually proved that they had never quite reached space. Even if they were the precursors to the cosmonauts, any of those who died could not have been said to have done so on the way to or the way back from space. One of the most famous pieces of evidence in this conspiracy comes from the two brothers who operated amateur radio equipment during the 1960s. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers produced what have become known as the Tor-Brett recordings, which in turn seemingly support the theory that some of the Russian cosmonauts did not make it back to Earth. The two brothers had repeatedly suggested that they have audio recordings of a number of space programs conducted by the Soviets during the 60s. They suggest that the recordings detail the tragic end of a number of failed launches. The mysterious nature of these recordings has sparked the public's interest for more than 5 decades, though there have been a number of rebuttals that have doubted the veracity of the tapes and the content they appear to detail. Despite the seemingly shocking content of the last few minutes of the cosmonauts' lives, others are seemingly not convinced. The audio quality and the accents of the voices have both been cited as reasons as to why they might not be entirely what the brothers claim them to be. One of the early cosmonauts for whom we do seem to have more evidence for is a man named Vladimir Ilyushin. Ilyushin was the son of a noted Soviet aeronautic designer and went on to become one of the country's top pilots. It is thought by some that he was actually the first man sent into space, supposedly on the 7th of April 1961, days before Yuri Gagarin made his famous flight. The theories about Ilyushin's flight suggest that when it came to the landing, he was forced to crash far from the intended descent zone. Instead of arriving back in Russia, he found himself in Chinese territory. He was immediately captured by the local authorities and spent a year under their careful eye before being sent back to Russia. Because this failure would have been deemed as embarrassing to the Soviet space program, it is suggested that they chose to downplay the importance of the flight and to instead promote Gagarin's flight as being the first, a flight which took place 5 days later. But this part of the theory is not without evidence. A British journalist named Denis Ogden was working in Russia as a correspondent for a communist newspaper in his home country and managed to gather together details of Ilyushin's treatment at the hands of the Chinese medical staff. Soviet sources, meanwhile, have always positioned Ilyushin as a great test pilot, but never a man who was considered a cosmonaut. The official line includes the detail that Ilyushin was seriously injured in a car accident in 1960 and, in order to mend his broken legs, was sent to China to receive traditional treatment unavailable in Russia at the time. However, the theory was given new life in 1999 when the son of Nikita Khrushchev, Sergei, appeared in a documentary named The Cosmonaut Cover-Up, wherein he suggested that Ilyushin had been held in China after a crashed spaceflight. It's Sergei's supposition that by the time Ilyushin arrived back in Russia, the Gagarin legend was already well established enough that it was impossible to dislodge. Nor was it deemed necessary to tell the public the truth about the captured cosmonaut. As a further point, any potential schism between the communist powers of Russia and China was to be hidden from the eyes of the West. Ilyushin died in 2010 and never confirmed or denied the theory about him actually being the first man in space. But if Ilyushin managed to make it into space and was denied the opportunity to revel in the legend of being the first human to do so, there may well have been other cover-ups that had more disastrous ends. These allegations suggest that while attempting to reach the moon, a conspiracy covered up the death of a number of Soviet cosmonauts who were lost in space. As we know today, the USSR would lose the race with America to be the first to reach the moon. However, the American flight that first reached the desired destination, Apollo 11, was not working in isolation. It has been suggested that a number of days before the American launch, the Soviets held a launch of their own. Up to this point, the USSR's rockets had not been working exactly as planned. Despite this lack of success, it is suggested that the decision to launch a manned mission was taken nevertheless, with the hope of beating the Americans to the destination by a matter of days. Taking place on the 3rd of July 1969, the N-1 rocket exploded on the launch pad. Everyone on board was killed. However, official statements denied that it had been intended to launch a manned mission and was simply another test flight. When it became clear that the Americans had won the race to the moon, the Soviet programs began to take on a less urgent tone. The ideological battle played out in the race to outer space had caused both countries to take an intense approach to scientific advancement. Huge amounts of time and money had been ploughed into both space programs in a show of strength as the world's two foremost superpowers faced off against one another on the world stage. Just as there were rumours that the Soviets were losing men in space, the Americans too experienced the tragedy of the death of their astronaut. As well as the fabled Apollo 13 mission in which 3 men nearly died, the men aboard Apollo 1, Roger Chaffee, Virgil Grissom and Edward White, were burned to death during a training exercise when their cabin caught fire. Unlike the USSR, however, it has been easier to confirm and document these events. Historians and conspiracy theorists have not had to try and navigate the complexity of the Soviet state's ability to keep secrets. But the conspiracy theories also took on a biased tone. One of the most popular American equivalents of the story suggests that the men recruited into the cosmonaut program were willing to throw away their lives for the good of the state. It has been suggested that those who came aboard the lunar program willingly entered into a suicide pact and were entirely happy to face their demise for the betterment of the Soviets' understanding of the space race. These suicide missions were so doomed that the flight did not include life support machines for the men aboard. Because this was deemed to be extra weight, the men were simply sent into space to operate the machinery before they would eventually pass away. It became politically advantageous for the American public to believe that the Soviet Union valued human life so little that they were willing to send their cosmonauts to their death, whereas the American astronauts were treated as heroes. But there remains little evidence for these, beyond the concept being mentioned in the book Omon-Ra by Pelevin, a Russian fiction writer. Despite the lack of evidence for anything other than the captured cosmonaut who spent a year in China, the idea of the doomed Soviet spaceflights has certainly caught the public's attention. The theory has worked its way into books, plays and films. The image of a doomed man floating high above the Earth is both chilling and the height of science fiction. As the space race seems so important in the day-to-day life of the 50s and 60s, the conspiracy theory of Russia's Lost Cosmonauts only worked to better the image of the American space program. Despite the fact that they had succeeded in putting a man into space before anyone else, the suggestions and rumours of the dead cosmonauts could be seen as a deliberate attempt to denigrate and discredit the Russians' effort. As with everything during the Cold War, the ideological battle was ingrained far deeper than we might be able to imagine today. In most conspiracy theories, attempting to find real hard evidence can be almost impossible. While we are sometimes looking to clandestine governments and corporations for the smoking gun, trying to extract such information from the behemoth of secrecy that was the Soviet Union is almost impossible. When you factor in the manner in which the USSR collapsed, it might be a long time indeed before someone is able to finally uncover the truth behind the Soviet space program. The only other method would be to journey out into the cold depths of space and check every single vessel for the remains of the lost Russian cosmonauts as they continue to orbit the Earth. The end. Don't forget to like and subscribe and press the wee bell notification. And a huge big thank you to all my subscribers and patrons. See you next week. Bye bye.